My name is Julia Hart, and I'm 38 years old. This happened in the summer of 2022, during what was supposed to be a peaceful RV trip with my husband Eric and our 8-year-old son Noah. We had no idea what awaited us in the Shasta Trinity National Forest, but I remember every moment like it was yesterday. Every whisper, every shadow, every scream. It started with Eric's idea to reconnect as a family. After I lost my job in the spring, things had been tense between us. I wasn't sure if it was the stress of losing our income or the fact that we'd grown distant, but I agreed to the trip, hoping it might bring us closer. Eric was optimistic as always, and Noah was thrilled to spend time outdoors. We drove our old RV deep into the forest, parking at a remote campsite near Castle Lake. Eric wanted to avoid the crowded campgrounds, so we found a spot that felt like the edge of the world. No cell service, no other campers, just the towering trees and the sound of wind whistling through the branches. The first night, I didn't sleep well. I lay in the dark, listening to the creaks and groans of the forest. It was just nature, I told myself, but at one point I could have sworn I heard faint whispers. I convinced myself it was Eric snoring or the wind shifting through the trees. The next morning, Eric and Noah were in high spirits. Eric made coffee over the campfire while Noah practiced throwing rocks into the woods. I tried to shake off my unease as Eric suggested we hike to a nearby overlook. "I'll teach Noah how to navigate the trails," he said, ruffling his hair. Noah beamed, eager to learn. As we packed our gear, I noticed scratches on the side of the RV. They weren't deep, but they were long and jagged, like claw marks. "Look at this," I said, pointing them out to Eric. "Bear, maybe," he said, shrugging. "We're in the wilderness, Jules. Relax." I wasn't convinced, but I let it go. The hike was beautiful, but tiring. Noah was a trooper, though, bounding ahead and pointing out every bird and squirrel he saw. Halfway through, he stopped suddenly, staring at something in the trees. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Nothing," he said after a pause. "Gregory says we should go this way." Gregory. "My friend," he said, smiling. Eric and I exchanged a look. Noah had always been imaginative, but this was new. "Maybe Gregory can join us for lunch," Eric joked. Noah didn't laugh. "He doesn't eat," he said matter-of-factly. That night, things got worse. After dinner, Noah went to bed early, unusually tired from the hike. Eric and I sat by the fire sipping wine. "Did you hear anything last night?" I asked. "Like what?" "I don't know. Whispers, maybe?" Eric chuckled. "It's just the wind. You're letting the isolation get to you." I wanted to believe him, but as the fire died down, I felt a prickling on the back of my neck, like we were being watched. Later, as I climbed into bed, I checked on Noah. He was fast asleep, but something about his face seemed different. Paler, like he'd been outside in the cold. The next morning, I woke to find Eric already outside, preparing to gather firewood. Noah was sitting by the RV, humming to himself. "What are you singing?" I asked. "Gregory taught it to me," he said, smiling. The melody was unsettling, a lilting tune that didn't seem to end. Eric returned after an hour carrying an armful of wood. He dropped it by the fire pit and rubbed his hands together. "We should have enough to last us a couple of days," he said. That's when I noticed his boots were muddy, even though the ground near the RV was dry. "Where did you go?" I asked. "Just into the woods," he said, avoiding my eyes. "It's nothing." Things unraveled quickly after that. That afternoon, Noah began sleepwalking. I found him wandering near the edge of the campsite, muttering words I didn't understand. When I shook him awake, he looked at me like he didn't recognize me. "Gregory said it's okay," he whispered. The scratches on the RV grew worse. deeper and more erratic. I found animal tracks circling the site. First deer, then something larger, almost human. Eric tried to stay calm, but I could see he was shaken. "We'll leave tomorrow," he said that night. "I'll wake up early and fix the engine." I nodded, though I wasn't sure we'd make it until morning. That night, Eric disappeared. I woke to the sound of footsteps outside the RV. At first, I thought it was him, but when I opened the door, he was gone. His flashlight lay on the ground, its beam pointing into the trees. "Eric?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. "Noah, stay here," I said, grabbing the flashlight. The forest was unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears. As I followed the beam of light, I saw claw marks on the trees, deep and fresh. Then I heard it, my voice calling from the woods. "Julia, help me." It was Eric's voice, but something about it was wrong, stretched and distorted. My stomach churned as I realized the sound was coming from multiple directions. "Eric?" I whispered. A shadow moved in the corner of my eye. I turned, and for the first time, I saw it. A gaunt, skeletal figure standing just beyond the light. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. The Wendigo. I ran back to the RV, slamming the door shut behind me. "Noah," I said, panting. "We're leaving now." Noah was sitting on the bed, humming the same eerie tune. "Gregory says we can't leave," he said. I grabbed him by the shoulders. "Listen to me, we have to go, now." But the RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered, refusing to turn over. Outside, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Julia? Mom?" I looked out the window and saw the Wendigo circling the RV, its eyes locked on us. It pressed a clawed hand against the glass, its grin widening. I remembered the journal I'd found earlier, buried under a pile of supplies in the RV. It had been left by a previous camper, filled with frantic scribbles about hunger spirits and their weakness to fire. Grabbing the propane tank, I dragged it outside. The Wendigo stood still, watching me with a predatory curiosity. My hands shook as I lit the matches, but I managed to ignite the propane, creating a fireball that roared into the night. The Wendigo screamed, a sound that pierced my skull before retreating into the shadows. Eric stumbled out of the woods as the fire died down, dazed and shivering. He didn't remember much, just the whispers and the feeling of being hunted. We left the next morning, the RV finally starting after Eric tinkered with the engine. Noah was quiet the entire drive home. He didn't mention Gregory again, but every so often I'd catch him humming that tune under his breath. We've never spoken of the Wendigo since, but sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers outside our window calling my name. I pray it never finds us again. My name is Henry Willis, Hank, to those who know me, and I'm 45 years old. This happened just last spring during one of my solo RV trips. I wasn't looking for trouble, just a quiet place to reflect and be alone. My wife, Maggie, passed away 3 years ago, and since then, the road has been my escape. This time, I chose Devil's Gate in the Angeles National Forest. I didn't know much about it, other than it was secluded, scenic, and a name Maggie had circled on our old map of dream camping spots. If I'd known what was waiting for me there, I wouldn't have gone. The drive up was uneventful. My old RV handled the winding forest roads better than I expected, and I arrived late in the afternoon. The air smelled of pine and damp earth as I parked near a trailhead, far from the main campground. Just the way I liked it. After setting up, I stood outside and took in the quiet. Towering trees surrounded me, their shadows long and sharp in the fading sunlight. A faint breeze rustled the leaves, and the only sound was the occasional chirp of a bird. Peaceful, I thought. Finally, some peace. I spent the evening tinkering with the RV's generator and cooking up some canned chili. As the night deepened, I sat outside by the fire, sipping a beer and staring into the flames. That's when I saw it. A figure, faint and distant, moving through the trees. I squinted, thinking it was another camper, though I hadn't seen anyone else nearby. "Hey!" I called out. No response. The figure stopped just at the edge of the firelight, and for a moment I thought it might step closer. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the darkness. I shook my head and muttered to myself, "You're seeing things, Hank." Still, the unease lingered. The next morning, I decided to explore. The trail near my site led into a dense section of forest, the kind of place where sunlight barely filters through the canopy. Maggie would have loved it. She always said there was magic in places like this. As I walked, I noticed something odd. Symbols carved into the trees, circles and lines that didn't look like the usual graffiti. They were old, weathered, and deliberate. A chill ran down my spine. Then I stumbled upon a small clearing. At its center was a ring of stones, arranged as if for a fire pit, though it hadn't been used in years. Inside the ring were strange objects, melted candles, a bundle of feathers tied with twine, and the charred remains of what looked like a photograph. I crouched to get a better look. The photo was of a couple, blurry from the damage, but unmistakably human. Something about it felt wrong, like I was intruding on something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. The drumming started that night. I was back at the RV, eating dinner, when I heard it. Faint, rhythmic, and coming from deep in the forest. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the sound grew louder, echoing through the trees. Thump, thump, thump. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside, scanning the woods. The drumming stopped just like that. The silence that followed was worse. I shook my head. "You're letting the isolation get to you." But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The real terror began the next night. I was in bed half asleep when I heard Maggie's voice. "Hank?" I bolted upright, my heart pounding. "Hank, I'm here." It was coming from outside. Throwing on a jacket, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the RV. The air was cold, and the forest was eerily quiet. "Maggie," I called. My voice cracked. Then I saw her. She was standing just beyond the trees, bathed in moonlight. Her hair was the same fiery red, her smile warm and familiar. She wore the denim jacket she'd always loved, the one I couldn't bring myself to throw away. "Hank," she said, her voice soft and sweet. "Come here." I froze. Every logical part of me screamed that this wasn't real, but seeing her standing there, it broke something inside me. I took a step forward. "Maggie, is it really you?" "Yes," she said, her smile widening. "I've missed you. Come closer." As I stepped closer, the flashlight flickered and her face changed. Her smile stretched too wide, her eyes hollowed out into black voids. Her voice deepened, twisting into something unnatural. "Come with me, Hank," it growled. I stumbled back, my flashlight dropping to the ground. By the time I grabbed it and pointed it back at her, she was gone. The next morning, I found the notebook. It was buried in one of the RV's storage compartments left behind by the previous owner. The pages were filled with frantic, scrawled handwriting. The words, "Hollow Ones," appeared over and over. They mimic the people you've lost. They feed on grief. If you follow them into the woods, you'll never come back. The more I read, the colder I felt. Whoever wrote this had encountered the same thing I had, and now it was after me. That night, the Hollow Ones returned. It wasn't just Maggie this time. There were more of them. Figures standing in the shadows, their faces blank and their voices overlapping. They whispered my name, their words dripping with malice. I stayed in the RV, clutching a wrench like a weapon, but the walls seemed thin against the whispers. The radio flickered on by itself, playing the song Maggie and I danced to at our wedding. "Leave me alone," I shouted, slamming the radio off. The RV shook, as if something heavy had landed on the roof. By dawn, I'd had enough. Remembering the notebook's warning, I dug through the RV for anything made of iron, grabbing a tire iron from the toolkit. Iron, the notebook said, could repel them. The Hollow Ones didn't wait for nightfall this time. As I stepped outside to inspect the RV, they surrounded me, appearing from the trees like ghosts. At their center was Maggie, or what was pretending to be her. She looked more solid now, her features more lifelike, but her eyes, those empty, hollow eyes. "Stay with me, Hank," she said, her voice soft again. "You don't have to be alone anymore." "No," I said, gripping the tire iron. "You're not real." Her smile twisted into a snarl. The others moved closer, their forms flickering and shifting, their voices rising in a chaotic chorus. I swung the tire iron wildly, the metal humming in the air. The Hollow Ones recoiled, their forms rippling like smoke in the wind. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I left everything behind. The RV, my supplies, everything, and ran. The forest seemed endless, the shadows stretching out like they were trying to trap me. But I didn't stop. Eventually, I stumbled onto a road and flagged down a passing car. The driver thought I was crazy, rambling about ghosts and Hollow Ones, but he took me to safety. I haven't been back to Devil's Gate since. Sometimes, though, I still hear Maggie's voice in my dreams, calling me back. I know better than to answer, but I'm not sure how much longer I can resist. My name is Samantha Nichols, Sam to most people, and I'm 31 years old. This happened in the spring of last year when I was working on a travel piece for Wanderlust magazine. My assignment was to find and write about hidden camping spots in California. It sounded like an easy enough gig, right? Pack up the RV, spend a few days alone in the woods, take some pictures, write a glowing review. But the woods have their own rules, and I didn't know the one I was walking into. I chose Redwood Creek Trail in Redwood National and State Parks. It wasn't the most popular trail, which made it perfect for the article. Tourists flock to the well-maintained paths, but I was after the untouched wilderness. That's where the magic happens, or so I thought. The drive-in was beautiful. Towering redwoods cast long shadows across the winding roads, and the air smelled of pine and damp moss. I parked my RV at a small, almost forgotten site near the trailhead. It wasn't much, a clearing surrounded by trees with just enough space to maneuver the RV, but it suited me fine. I spent the first evening settling in, snapping pictures of the golden sunset through the trees. I even wrote a few notes for the article, my usual mix of poetic observations and practical tips. It felt good to be working again, even if I was alone out here. Maybe especially because I was alone. But things started to feel off the moment the sun went down. It was just after dinner when I heard the first noise, a deep, guttural growl, low enough to make the hair on my arms stand up. Coyotes, I told myself. Or maybe a bear. I wasn't new to camping, and I knew the woods had their own soundtrack. Still, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining it into the trees. The beam of light caught nothing but trunks and leaves. No eyes reflecting back at me, no movement in the underbrush. but the growl came again, this time followed by the distinct snap of a branch breaking. I called out, "Hello? Is someone out there?" Silence. I stood there for a few moments, scanning the woods before heading back inside and locking the door behind me. Maybe I was being paranoid, or maybe I wasn't. The next morning, I decided to hike the trail, hoping the daylight would clear my head. The forest was beautiful, with sunlight filtering through the redwoods in golden shafts. The air was crisp and quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. About an hour in, I came across another camper, or what was left of his campsite. The tent was shredded, its fabric hanging in tatters from the poles. Scattered around were torn pieces of clothing, a broken backpack, and what looked like a bloodstain on the dirt. I crouched down, my stomach twisting as I saw claw marks gouged deep into a nearby tree. Whatever had done this wasn't small. "Jesus," I whispered. There was no sign of the camper. No footprints leading away, no belongings that looked salvageable. I didn't stick around long, snapping a few pictures with shaking hands before heading back to the RV. Things escalated that night. I'd just finished writing up my notes when the lights in the RV flickered. The hum of the generator died, leaving me in complete darkness. My heart thudded in my chest as I fumbled for the flashlight. Before I could turn it on, I heard it again. Growling. Closer this time, just outside the RV. I held my breath, listening as something heavy scraped along the side of the vehicle. My mind raced through possibilities: bear, mountain lion, anything that would make sense. But when the growling stopped, I heard something worse. A voice. "Sammy, come outside." I froze. It was my father's voice. He'd passed away 10 years ago, but I'd recognize that voice anywhere. "Sammy, it's safe out here." My hand shook as I switched on the flashlight, pointing it toward the window. Nothing. Just the trees swaying in the wind. "Come on, Sammy," the voice called again. This time from the other side of the RV. I grabbed the fire poker I kept near the door, gripping it tightly. By morning, I was done pretending this was just wildlife. I wanted to leave, but when I turned the ignition, the RV wouldn't start. The battery was dead, though I'd checked it the day before. I stepped outside to assess the situation and saw them. Claw marks etched deep into the side of the RV, long and deliberate. A trail of blood-stained leaves led away from the vehicle, disappearing into the woods. My instincts screamed at me to follow the trail, though every rational part of me said to stay put. I told myself I'd only go a short distance, just far enough to figure out what I was dealing with. The forest seemed different as I walked. Darker, the air heavier. The trail twisted in ways I didn't recognize, even though I'd been here the day before. That's when I saw it. A figure standing between the trees, its bark-like skin blending perfectly with the redwoods. Its limbs were too long, its movements too smooth, like it wasn't entirely solid. The redwood stalker. It turned its hollow black eyes toward me and my breath caught. I took a step back, but my foot hit a branch, and the snap echoed through the silence. The creature's head tilted, as if it was studying me. Then, with a flicker of movement, it was gone. I ran, or at least I tried to. The forest twisted around me, trails leading nowhere, trees seeming to shift positions. I could hear the stalker's footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, as if it was toying with me. When I finally stumbled into a clearing, I realized it wasn't by accident. This place had been waiting for me. At the center of the clearing was a ring of stones, much like the one I'd seen before. But this one was littered with bones, animal and human alike, and stained with dark, dried blood. I heard the voice again. "Sammy, it's safe now." It was closer this time, coming from all directions. The stalker stepped into the clearing, its bark-like skin rippling as it moved. It raised one long, clawed hand, and I knew it was time to fight or die. I pulled the magnesium fire starter from my pocket and struck it, igniting a small flame in the dry leaves at my feet. The fire caught quickly, spreading into a barrier between me and the creature. The stalker hesitated, its hollow eyes narrowing as it stepped back. But it wasn't gone, not yet. Grabbing my camera, I turned on the flash and aimed it at the creature. The bright light seemed to disorient it, its form flickering like static on a broken TV. I snapped photo after photo, each flash making it retreat further. Finally, with a guttural growl, the stalker melted into the shadows, leaving me alone in the clearing. I didn't stop running until I reached the RV. By some miracle, the engine started this time, and I didn't look back as I drove away. I still don't know what the Redwood stalker is, whether it's an ancient spirit, a creature of the forest, or something else entirely. But I know this: I'll never write about that trail. Some places are better left untouched, their secrets buried beneath the trees. And as for the photos I took, they're still on my camera, untouched. I can't bring myself to look at them. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I wonder what I'll see if I do. My name is Sarah Reed. I'm 24 years old, and what I'm about to tell you happened last October in Los Padres National Forest, California. At the time, I thought it was going to be the perfect trip. A little adventure with Dylan, my boyfriend of 6 months. But I was wrong. So very wrong. It started with an idea, my idea, to visit a hidden hot spring in the Sespe Wilderness. I'd read about it on some travel blog, and the photos looked incredible. Steaming pools surrounded by rugged cliffs, the kind of place no one would believe existed without pictures to prove it. Dylan was hesitant at first. He's the practical one, always looking up trail conditions, checking equipment, and planning backup routes. Me? I wanted an adventure, something spontaneous, something magical. We drove into the wilderness in Dylan's beat-up Jeep, the back loaded with supplies and my old 2-person tent. I didn't tell him I'd borrowed the tent from a friend and hadn't checked it beforehand. I figured what could go wrong. The trailhead was marked but faded, a little wooden sign barely visible through the chaparral. Dylan grumbled as we strapped on our packs. "You sure about this, Sarah? No map, no signal, just some blog post from 2 years ago?" "It's fine," I said, rolling my eyes. "People do this all the time." The first few hours were great. The sun was warm but not too hot, the scenery beautiful. Dylan even seemed to relax a little, holding my hand as we climbed over boulders and waded through shallow streams. We joked about city folks trying to rough it out here, feeling like we were the only people for miles. Then we missed the turnoff. "I think it was back there," Dylan said, pointing to a narrow, overgrown path. No, I insisted. The blog said to follow the creek. We argued for a while, and Dylan finally gave in, muttering about how I was going to owe him dinner if we got lost. We didn't make it to the hot springs. By late afternoon, it was clear we were off track. The creek had vanished, replaced by rocky hills that seemed to stretch forever. Dylan checked his phone, but there was no service. "We'll camp here," he said, dropping his pack. "We can backtrack tomorrow." The spot wasn't ideal. Rocky ground, no water source, but the view of the sunset made up for it. I set up the tent while Dylan gathered firewood. That's when I heard it. "Sarah." It was faint, almost like the wind, but unmistakable. I turned, expecting to see Dylan, but he was still in the distance, arms full of wood. "Did you say something?" I called out. "What?" he shouted back. I hesitated, then shook my head. Probably just my imagination. The night was cold, colder than I expected. The wind whipped against the tent, and I regretted not bringing a thicker sleeping bag. Dylan was already asleep beside me, his breathing steady. I stared up at the tent ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest, or rather, the lack of them. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence, broken only by the wind. I drifted off eventually, but my sleep was restless, filled with strange dreams of voices calling my name. The next morning, things got worse. "What the hell?" Dylan muttered as we packed up camp. I followed his gaze to a tree nearby. Deep, jagged scratches ran down its trunk, as if something with claws had raked against it. I laughed nervously. "Probably a bear," I said. "Bears don't leave marks like this," Dylan replied, his tone serious. We found more scratches as we started hiking back, along with something else. A crude figure made of sticks and twine, hanging from a low branch. It looked vaguely human, its arms and legs bent at unnatural angles. Dylan grabbed my arm. "Who the hell is out here making this crap?" "I don't know," I whispered, suddenly feeling very small. As the day wore on, the forest seemed to change. The trail we thought we were following kept looping back on itself, the same landmarks appearing again and again. At first, Dylan blamed me. "We're going in circles because you didn't listen," he snapped. But soon, even he admitted something was wrong. "It doesn't make sense," he muttered, staring at his compass. The needle spun wildly, refusing to settle. By late afternoon, we were both on edge. Dylan barely spoke, his jaw clenched as he pushed through the underbrush. I trailed behind, too tired to argue. That's when I saw it. A figure in the distance, standing between the trees. "Dylan," I whispered, grabbing his sleeve. "Look." He turned, but the figure was gone. "What did you see?" I don't know. A person, maybe?" "No one's out here but us," he said firmly, but I could tell he didn't believe it. That night, the forest came alive. We camped again, too exhausted to keep going. Dylan built a fire, though the wood was damp and smoked more than it burned. As we sat in silence, I thought I heard footsteps circling the campsite. Dylan shook his head when I mentioned it. "Just the wind," he said. But then came the voices. At first, they were faint, blending with the crackling fire. Then they grew louder, clearer. A man's voice, deep and gravelly, called Dylan's name. A child's laugh echoed from somewhere beyond the light. Dylan jumped to his feet, holding his flashlight like a weapon. "Who's there?" he shouted. No answer. We didn't sleep. Around midnight, I swore I saw something at the edge of the firelight. A tall, thin figure, its limbs bent at impossible angles. It swayed as it walked, almost like it was dancing, and its face was wrong. Dylan saw it too. He grabbed my hand, pulling me closer to the fire. "Stay here," he whispered. "What are you doing?" I hissed, but he was already moving toward the figure, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The figure retreated, its movements jerky and unnatural. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. Dylan disappeared into the trees, and I was alone. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. The fire was dying, and the shadows seemed to grow thicker, closing in around me. I heard Dylan's voice, faint and distant. "Sarah, help!" I grabbed the flashlight, heart pounding, and ran toward the sound. What I found wasn't Dylan. It looked like him. Same build, same clothes, but his face was twisted, stretched into a grotesque smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sarah," it said, its voice wrong, too high-pitched. "Come with me." I backed away, shaking my head. "You're not Dylan." It cocked its head, the smile growing wider. Then, from the trees behind it, more figures emerged, all of them bent and crooked, their faces pale and lifeless. I turned and ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the Jeep. The forest seemed to shift around me, trails appearing and disappearing. The figures followed, their whispers growing louder, but they never touched me. They just watched, waiting. When I finally reached the Jeep, I slammed the door and locked it, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the keys. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the dirt road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. Dylan never came back. The rangers searched for weeks, but they found nothing. No tent, no supplies, not even a footprint. Sometimes, late at night, I hear his voice, calling my name, faint and distant, just like that night in the forest. I don't answer. I don't think it's him. My name is Jonah Carter. I'm 38 years old, and last October, I spent 3 nights alone in Death Valley National Park near Racetrack Playa. I've been camping for years, living off-grid in an old RV I fixed up myself. I thought I'd seen everything nature had to offer, deserts, mountains, forests, but I was wrong. What happened in that barren expanse of cracked earth and shifting stones shook me to my core. I'm not sure I came back from it whole. I'd heard about Racetrack Playa from other travelers, a dry lake bed where the rocks move by themselves, leaving trails in the cracked earth. No one really knows how it happens. Some say it's wind and ice. Others claim it's something stranger. I wasn't looking for answers. I wanted to take photos for my blog to capture something unique. I arrived late in the afternoon, parking my RV on the edge of the playa. The landscape was stark and alien, flat, cracked earth stretching out for miles, surrounded by jagged mountains. The rocks were scattered across the surface like chess pieces, each with a long trail carved into the dirt behind it. There wasn't another soul in sight. Perfect. I spent the first hour setting up camp, pulling out my camera gear and scouting for the best shots. The silence was deafening, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing. I was used to being alone, but this was different. The emptiness felt heavy, pressing down on me. As the sun set, the sky turned a brilliant shade of orange, then purple. I snapped photos until the light faded and the stars came out. Death Valley has some of the darkest skies in the country, and that night, the Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a ribbon of light. I should have felt awe. Instead, I felt small, insignificant, exposed. The first night, I woke up to whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind. The RV shook slightly, and the desert air whistled through the cracks. But as I lay there, I realized the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the RV, faint and distant, like someone speaking just out of earshot. I sat up, heart pounding. "Hello?" My voice felt loud and out of place in the stillness. The whispers stopped. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it around the RV. Nothing. Just my gear and the usual clutter of books and tools. I told myself it was a dream, that my mind was playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I noticed something strange. One of the rocks near the RV had moved. When I parked, it had been about 20 feet away. Now, it was closer, its trail carved into the dirt like a scar. I smiled to myself. "Looks like I caught the magic in action," I muttered, pulling out my camera. I snapped a few photos and moved on, telling myself it was just the wind. But deep down, I felt uneasy. The trail wasn't straight. It zigzagged, like the rock had been dragged by something alive. That day, I hiked out to explore the playa. The sun was brutal, and the heat shimmered off the cracked ground, making the horizon waver like a mirage. I noticed more rocks had shifted, their trails fresh and erratic. Some even seemed to form patterns, circles, spirals. It didn't feel random. As I walked, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, crunching on the dry ground. I spun around, but no one was there. Just the rocks and their silent, inexplicable trails. By the time I got back to the RV, I was exhausted. I told myself the heat was getting to me, that I needed water and rest. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. The second night was worse. I woke up to a loud thud like something had hit the side of the RV. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. The beam swept across the playa, illuminating nothing but the flat expanse of dirt and rocks. But then I saw it, a tall shadow standing at the edge of the light. It didn't move. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking. No response. I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The shadow seemed to grow taller, stretching unnaturally. And then it disappeared, like smoke blown away by the wind. I slammed the door and locked it, my hands shaking. The whispers started again, louder this time, echoing through the RV. They spoke my name. "Jonah? Jonah?" I covered my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. "It's not real," I whispered. "It's not real." By morning, I was questioning my sanity. My gear had been moved, my camera, my water bottle, even my boots. They were scattered around the RV like someone had rummaged through my things. The rock that had moved closer the day before was now only a few feet away, its trail looping in on itself like a spiral. I decided I'd had enough. I packed up and tried to start the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I checked the battery, the fuel line. Everything looked fine, but the vehicle was dead. I sat in the driver's seat staring at the playa. The silence was unbearable. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Shadows darting between the rocks. The third night, it came for me. The sun had barely set when the RV shook violently, as if something massive had slammed into it. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, my instincts screaming at me to run. The playa was alive with movement, figures shifting and twisting in the darkness, their shapes indistinct. But one stood out. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and bent at unnatural angles. Its eyes glowed red, piercing through the night. It didn't walk so much as glide, its movements smooth and unnatural. "Jonah," it said, its voice deep and hollow. "You can't run from me." I stumbled back, slamming the door. The whispers filled the RV, overlapping and growing louder until they were a roar. The lights flickered and the air grew cold, suffocating. I grabbed my camera, desperate for some kind of weapon. The entity appeared inside the RV, its shadowy form filling the space. It spoke again, its voice a mixture of my own and someone else's. "You left him," it said. The memory hit me like a punch to the gut. My best friend Mike. The accident on the construction site. The scaffolding had collapsed and I hadn't been able to save him. I'd carried that guilt ever since. The entity's form shifted, becoming Mike. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. "You could have saved me," it said, "but you didn't." Tears streamed down my face. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry." The entity lunged, its shadowy limbs reaching for me. I raised the camera and pressed the shutter, the flash blinding it. It recoiled, shrieking, and I bolted out of the RV. I ran across the playa, the stars above spinning like a kaleidoscope. The entity chased me, its voice echoing in my head. "You can't escape." I reached the center of the playa and turned to face it. "I know," I said, "but I won't run anymore." The entity hesitated, its form flickering. The whispers grew softer, then stopped. The figure dissolved into the darkness, leaving me alone under the stars. By morning, the RV started as if nothing had happened. I drove out of Death Valley without looking back. When I checked my camera later, all the photos from Racetrack Playa were gone, as if the desert had erased them. I don't know what it was I faced out there, a spirit, a devil, or just my own guilt made manifest. All I know is, I survived. But part of me will always be out there under the stars, where the rocks move and the shadows wait. My name is Mia Harper, and I'm 29 years old. Last September, I drove my RV to Shasta Trinity National Forest, hoping to find inspiration for my writing. I thought it would be like the other trips I've taken, quiet, peaceful, a chance to reset. Instead, it turned into the most horrifying experience of my life. Even now, I can't tell if I escaped entirely. The trip started innocently enough. I'd been reading about Castle Crags Wilderness online. Its jagged granite peaks and dense forests seemed like the perfect setting for a short story I was working on. There was something about the mystery of it all, the stories of strange disappearances over the years that intrigued me. As a writer, I always figured curiosity was my greatest strength. I reached the campsite late in the afternoon. It was more remote than I'd imagined. No other cars, no hikers, just endless trees and the crags towering in the distance like watchful giants. Perfect, I thought. No distractions. After parking the RV, I set up a small table outside with my notebook and camera. The air smelled of pine and earth, and the silence was profound. Not the usual kind of silence, though. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness. I convinced myself it was my imagination and got to work jotting down ideas as the sun dipped below the horizon. That night, I heard the first sound. It was faint at first, a rustling outside the RV. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, and listened. Then came a knock. 3 sharp taps on the door. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. No answer. I grabbed the flashlight I kept by the bed and peeked out the window. Nothing but the dark silhouette of the forest. My pulse hammered in my ears as I opened the door and shone the light into the night. No one was there, but the ground near the RV was disturbed. Small footprints leading into the trees. Too small to be a man's, too large to be a child's. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. It was probably an animal, I told myself, though my gut said otherwise. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. The sky was overcast, and the air felt heavy, like a storm was brewing. I hiked toward the crags, snapping photos along the way, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. About 2 miles in, I found something strange. An abandoned campsite. The tent was shredded, its poles bent at odd angles. A sleeping bag lay nearby, stained and torn, along with a backpack that looked like it had been ripped open. Scattered around the site were personal items. A pair of glasses, a notebook, a small camera with a cracked screen. I shouldn't have touched it, but curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the camera and checked the memory card. It still worked, so I slipped it into my pocket. I'd review the photos later. That night, back in the RV, I sat down with my laptop and the camera's memory card. Most of the photos were ordinary. Shots of the forest, the crags, some blurry selfies. But then I saw it. In one photo, taken near the edge of the forest, a figure stood in the background. It was tall and thin, its limbs too long, its face sunken and hollow. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but the more I stared, the more certain I became that it was watching whoever took the photo. I shut the laptop, my hands trembling. The air in the RV felt colder than it should have, and I suddenly felt like I wasn't alone. Then I heard it. "Mia," a voice whispered from outside. It sounded like my mother's voice, but she lived hours away. I froze. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely audible. "Mia!" The voice came again, soft and inviting. "Come outside." I grabbed the flashlight and slowly opened the door. The forest loomed like a wall of darkness. My flashlight beam danced across the trees, catching movement. A figure darting between the trunks. My stomach dropped. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my mind racing. What the hell was that? An animal? A person? No, it couldn't have been a person. The way it moved wasn't human. The next day, I decided to leave. Whatever inspiration I'd hoped to find wasn't worth this. But when I turned the key in the RV's ignition, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. "Come on," I muttered, hitting the steering wheel. "Not now." With no cell service and no way to call for help, I decided to hike to the nearest trailhead, about 6 miles away. I packed a small bag with water, snacks, and a map, and set off, hoping to flag down another camper or ranger. The forest was eerily quiet. The only sound the crunch of my boots on the dirt. About an hour in, I heard something behind me. Footsteps, deliberate and heavy. I turned, but no one was there. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing through the trees. Silence. I kept walking, my pace quickening. The footsteps followed, always just out of sight. Then I heard it again, a voice. This time, it was my own voice, calling for help. "Over here!" it shouted. I froze. The sound came from deeper in the forest, off the trail. I knew I should keep walking, but something about hearing my own voice paralyzed me. Slowly, I turned toward the trees. That's when I saw it. A figure stood about 20 feet away, half hidden by the shadows. It was tall and impossibly thin, its arms and legs bent at unnatural angles. Its face was blank, except for 2 deep hollows where its eyes should have been. It tilted its head as if curious, and then it spoke. "Mia." The sound came from its hollow mouth, but it wasn't just one voice, it was a chorus, layers of voices I recognized and didn't recognize, all overlapping. My legs moved before my mind could catch up, and I ran. I don't know how long I ran, but when I finally stopped, I was completely lost. The trail was gone, and the forest seemed darker than before. I tried to catch my breath, leaning against a tree, when I saw them. There were more of them now, standing in a loose circle around me. The hollow ones. They didn't move, but their heads turned to follow me as I backed away. Their mouths opened, releasing whispers that crawled under my skin. I stumbled into a clearing and saw it, a stone altar covered in strange carvings. It looked ancient, weathered by time, but the symbols on it were fresh, like they'd been cut recently. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to it, like it was the key to everything. One of the hollow ones stepped closer, its arm reaching out. I screamed, fumbling in my bag for anything I could use. My hand closed around a box of matches. I struck one and held it up, the small flame flickering in the darkness. The hollow ones hesitated, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. Without thinking, I lit the edge of the altar. The fire caught quickly, spreading across the stone and illuminating the clearing. The hollow ones shrieked, their forms flickering like shadows in the wind. I ran again, following the faint light of the fire until I found the trail. When I finally reached the RV, I didn't stop to think. I turned the key, and this time, the engine roared to life. I sped down the dirt road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I don't know what those things were, or why they let me go, but ever since that night I've felt off. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear whispers, and when I close my eyes I see their hollow faces, watching, waiting. I escaped the forest, but I'm not sure I escaped them. My name is Abigail Cross, and I'm 30 years old. This happened in late October of last year during a trip to Death Valley National Park, a place I'd always been drawn to for its eerie beauty. I'm a freelance journalist, and my passion is exploring the unknown, urban legends, paranormal encounters, mysteries of the natural world. But nothing could have prepared me for the terror I experienced at Devil's Hole. It started innocently enough. I had read about Devil's Hole, a mysterious, water-filled cavern in the Amargosa Desert, rumored to be haunted by vengeful spirits. Disappearances, strange sounds, and even deaths had been linked to the area. My boyfriend, Ben Hart, a practical and skeptical park ranger, agreed to join me on the trip, mostly to keep me out of trouble, as he put it. My younger brother, Mikey, 28, brought his drones and cameras, excited to help me capture footage for my blog. And my best friend, Sophie Wells, a spiritual enthusiast, insisted on tagging along, eager to explore the energies of the place. The drive to Death Valley was rough. A tire blew out on our Jeep halfway there, and by the time we arrived at the remote trailhead, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The dusty desert air felt thick, almost oppressive, as we loaded up our gear for the hike to our campsite near Devil's Hole. Sophie commented on the weird energy of the place, earning an eye roll from Ben. "Just rocks and sand, Soph," Ben said. "Nothing mystical about it." But as we trekked farther from the trailhead, even I began to feel something was off. The landscape was unnervingly silent, with no signs of wildlife. No chirping crickets, no distant howls of coyotes. Just our footsteps crunching on gravel and the occasional clink of Mikey's equipment. We reached the campsite just as the last light faded. Setting up was harder than expected. Mikey's drone batteries inexplicably drained, leaving us without aerial footage, and Sophie's lantern flickered and died despite being fully charged. "That's not normal," Sophie said, frowning as she held the unlit lantern. "Probably cheap batteries," Ben said, though I noticed him glance uneasily toward the horizon. After a quick dinner of dehydrated meals, we settled into our tents. That night, I woke suddenly, my heart pounding. At first, I didn't know what had startled me. Then I heard it. A faint, high-pitched wail like the cry of a child, carried on the wind. "Sophie?" I whispered, sitting up in my sleeping bag. "I hear it too," she replied from her tent. Ben groaned. "It's just the wind. Go back to sleep." But it didn't sound like wind. It sounded like someone, or something, out there. The next day, we made our way to Devil's Hole, a deceptively small, fenced-off opening in the ground surrounded by signs warning of unstable terrain. The water inside was crystal clear, but impossibly deep, disappearing into darkness. "It's beautiful," Sophie said, but her voice wavered. As I leaned over to get a better look, I felt an overwhelming pull, as if the water was calling to me. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I saw something move beneath the surface. A pale, humanoid figure with empty eyes. "Abby!" Ben grabbed my arm, yanking me back. "Careful, the rocks are loose." "I'm fine," I said, shaking off the strange feeling. But I couldn't shake the image of that face, staring up at me from the depths. Mikey set up his camera, trying to capture the eerie beauty of the place. He sent up his last functional drone, but it malfunctioned almost immediately, veering wildly before crashing into a crevice. "Damn it," he muttered, retrieving the broken device. "It's like this place hates tech." The atmosphere grew heavier as the day wore on. Sophie found strange symbols scratched into the rocks, triangles, spirals, and claw-like marks. "These look ancient," she said. "Maybe Native American?" "Or just scratches from animals," Ben said. But he didn't sound convinced. That night, the cries returned, louder and closer. This time, they came from all directions, echoing across the barren landscape. "I don't think those are animals," Mikey said, his usual humor gone. I stepped out of my tent, flashlight in hand, and froze. In the distance, silhouetted against the moonlight, stood a figure. It looked like Ben, but something was wrong. It was too still, too silent. "Ben?" I whispered. But the real Ben stepped out of his tent behind me. "Abby, what's wrong?" I pointed, but the figure was gone. The next morning, Sophie refused to go near Devil's Hole, insisting that we needed to leave. Ben argued, saying we'd come too far to turn back now. Tensions flared. "It's not worth it, Abby," Sophie said. "I'm telling you, this place is dangerous." "We'll be fine," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. As we packed up camp, Mikey screamed. We ran to find him sprawled on the ground, claw marks raked across his back. "Something pushed me," he said, his voice trembling. I didn't see it, but I felt it. It was strong. That evening, the cries became unbearable. Sophie performed a ritual with sage, chanting softly as she moved around the campsite. Ben watched in frustrated silence, but I noticed his hands were shaking. When night fell, the figures returned. This time, there were 3 of them, standing motionless at the edge of the camp. Their faces were hollow, their limbs elongated and unnaturally thin. "They're not real," Ben said, gripping a flashlight. "Just an illusion." But when one of the figures took a step forward, I knew he was wrong. The attack came suddenly. The figures moved with inhuman speed, their hands clawing at the tents, their hollow eyes glowing. Ben grabbed a makeshift weapon, a rock, and swung at one of them, but his arm went straight through it. "Run!" he shouted. Sophie, Mikey, and I bolted toward the trailhead, but Ben stayed behind, throwing himself at the creatures to buy us time. As we ran, I heard him scream, followed by a deafening splash. We didn't stop running until we reached the Jeep. Sophie drove, while I sat in the back, clutching Mikey, who was sobbing. When we finally made it back to civilization, I reviewed Mikey's footage. In the last video, Ben was visible, being dragged into the water by the pale, humanoid figures. Just before the screen cut to static, one of them turned toward the camera. It had my face. I never published the footage. Some things are better left buried. But I'll never forget the cries that haunted the desert night, or the man I lost to Devil's Hole. My name is Elliot Grayson, and I'm 36 years old. I work as a wildlife biologist, and last year, during a solo trip to Jedediah Smith Redwood State Park, I had an experience that changed me forever. I'd always been a skeptic, someone who believes nature can be explained through science. But what happened out there defies explanation. I'm writing this not because I think anyone will believe me, but because I need to tell someone, anyone, about what I saw. I arrived at Jedediah Smith on a chilly October morning. My RV was packed with supplies for a week-long trip. I had planned to track nocturnal animals for a research paper I was working on, using motion-activated cameras and acoustic monitors. The forest was stunning. Massive redwoods towering like ancient guardians, their thick canopy swallowing most of the sunlight. The air smelled of damp earth and moss. At the ranger station, I met Chloe Martinez, a young park ranger with an easy smile. She handed me a map and pointed out some trails. "Stick to the marked areas," she said. "A few spots are closed off due to unstable terrain, and, well, some hikers have gone missing in the deeper parts of the park." I raised an eyebrow. "Missing? Like lost?" "Yeah, probably. These woods are dense, easy to get turned around." Her tone was casual, but something in her eyes made me pause. She looked like she wanted to say more, but didn't. I drove my RV to a secluded campsite deep in the park. It was perfect, quiet, shaded, and far from the main trails. That evening, as I set up my cameras, I noticed how still the forest was. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence. I chalked it up to the sheer density of the trees. The first night was uneventful, though I thought I heard faint footsteps outside my RV. When I checked, there was nothing there. Just my nerves, I told myself. The next day, I set out on foot to explore the area. At a trailhead, I encountered a grizzled old man sitting on a fallen log, sharpening a knife. His clothes were tattered, and his face was leathery from years in the sun. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, not looking up from his knife. I hesitated. "I'm a biologist. I've camped alone plenty of times." He chuckled dryly. "This ain't like other places. The forest here, it doesn't like strangers." "What do you mean?" I asked, but he just shook his head. "They call 'em the hungry ones," he said after a long pause. "Used to be people a long time ago. Now they're something else. If you hear them at night, don't answer. Don't follow the sounds." I wanted to dismiss him as a crackpot, but something about his tone unsettled me. That night, the first sign of trouble came. I was reviewing footage from my cameras when I noticed something strange. One of the cameras had captured a dark, humanoid figure moving between the trees. It was fast, too fast to be human, and its limbs were elongated, almost spider-like. I replayed the footage several times, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. Then the scratching started. Faint at first, like twigs brushing against the side of the RV. I froze, listening. The sound grew louder, more insistent, moving from one side of the RV to the other. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The forest was pitch black, my beam cutting through the darkness in jagged arcs. There was nothing there. No animals, no wind, nothing that could have made the sound. I told myself I was imagining things and went back inside, but sleep didn't come easily. The next day, I found the first real evidence that something was wrong. While hiking off trail, I stumbled upon an abandoned campsite. The tent was shredded, its fabric hanging in tatters like the aftermath of an animal attack. A rusted camping stove lay overturned, and personal belongings, clothes, shoes, a half-burned journal, were scattered around. But there were no signs of the campers themselves. Just the tent, the belongings, and the forest swallowing it all. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. That evening, I reviewed the footage again. This time, the shadowy figure was closer to the camera. It didn't just move, it lurked, crouching behind a tree, watching the lens. Its face was pale, featureless except for hollow black eyes. I was rattled, but tried to focus on my work. That's when I saw the tracks. Large, clawed prints in the dirt near my RV. They didn't match any animal I'd ever studied. By the third night, the forest felt alive, like it was closing in on me. The scratching returned, louder now, accompanied by guttural growls. My flashlight revealed nothing, but I knew something was out there. Around midnight, I heard a low, raspy whisper. "Elliot." I froze. The voice came from the trees, faint but unmistakable. It called my name again, drawing it out like a taunt. My first instinct was to follow the sound, but the old man's warning echoed in my mind. Don't follow the sounds. Instead, I locked the RV door and stayed inside, gripping my knife. The whispers continued for hours, fading just before dawn. The next day, I met the old man again, deeper in the woods. He looked at me with weary eyes, as if he already knew what I'd experienced. "You saw them, didn't you?" he asked. I nodded. "What are they?" "They were people once, starved during a bad winter, turned to cannibalism to survive. The forest cursed them, made them into what you saw. They can't die, and they're always hungry. Why me? I asked. Why are they after me? They go after anyone who gets too close. You're in their territory now. That night, the creatures attacked. I heard them before I saw them, growling, snarling, their clawed hands scraping against the RV. When I looked out the window, I saw their pale, emaciated bodies circling, their black eyes glinting in the moonlight. One of them climbed onto the roof, rocking the RV as it moved. I grabbed my knife and flashlight, ready to defend myself, but I knew I couldn't fight them all. The old man appeared out of nowhere, wielding a torch and yelling at me to run. The creatures hissed and recoiled from the flames, but they didn't retreat. The old man held them off while I fled into the forest. The chase was a blur. The creatures moved through the trees with unnatural speed, herding me deeper into the woods. I tripped over roots, my flashlight flickering, the growls closing in. At some point, I found myself at the edge of a ravine. I turned to face them, my knife trembling in my hand. But before they could reach me, the old man appeared again, his torch blazing. "Go!" he shouted. "I'll hold them off." I didn't want to leave him, but I had no choice. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing at the edge of a trail. When I looked back, the forest was silent. The creatures were gone. I made it back to the RV just as the sun rose. The old man never returned. The park rangers didn't believe me when I told them what happened. Chloe looked troubled, but said nothing. As I drove away, I noticed a strange marking on the side of my RV. A clawed handprint, blackened like it had been burned into the metal. A warning, or maybe a promise. I haven't been back to the Redwood since. I don't think I ever will. Some things are better left undisturbed. My name is Lila Foster, and I'm 32 years old. I'm a travel nurse who spends most of my time on the road, bouncing from assignment to assignment. When I'm not working, I escape into the wilderness with my RV, seeking peace in the quiet places most people overlook. But last October, on a solo trip to Big Bear Lake, I found something I didn't want to find, something that still haunts me to this day. I arrived at Big Bear late on a crisp Friday evening. The air smelled of pine, and the lake reflected the amber glow of the setting sun. It was perfect. My plan was simple: 2 days of hiking and solitude. I'd found a little used trail on an obscure hiking forum, one that supposedly led to a secluded viewpoint. That's exactly the kind of adventure I craved. The trailhead was marked by a rusted sign warning hikers to avoid the area due to unstable conditions. I ignored it. Warnings like that were usually just liability disclaimers, and I'd hiked enough rugged trails to handle myself. I parked my RV in a nearby clearing and settled in for the night. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. I wrote it off as normal for the elevation and turned in early. The first odd thing happened the next morning. I was a mile into the trail when I heard it. Faint laughter. I froze mid-step, straining to hear. It came again, echoing through the trees. A child's giggle, high-pitched and fleeting. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish. No answer. Just the wind brushing through the pines. I pressed on, though the laughter stayed with me. About 20 minutes later, I found something strange. A rusted tricycle, half buried in the dirt. Its handlebars were twisted, and its paint was flaking off in patches. Around it lay scattered toys, dolls with missing limbs, a toy truck covered in moss. My skin prickled. What were toys doing out here? This trail wasn't marked on the main maps, and it was far too isolated for kids to play around. I took a photo, intending to ask someone about it later, and kept hiking. That evening, back at the RV, things got worse. I just finished dinner when I heard a soft tapping on the windows. I froze, fork halfway to my mouth. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Is someone there?" I called. The tapping stopped. The clearing was empty, the forest yawning dark and quiet around me. I swept the light along the ground and saw small footprints in the dirt, leading away from the RV. They were tiny, like a child's, but barefoot. I stayed outside for a long time, my flashlight trembling in my hand, before finally retreating inside and locking the door. The next day, I met Daniel Carr. He was a wiry man in his 50s with weathered skin and sharp eyes. He lived in a small cabin near the lake, tending a collection of old books and local artifacts. I found him when I stopped at the general store to pick up some supplies and decided to ask about the trail. "You're camping near the Whispering Trail?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded. "That's what it's called?" He hesitated. "Locals call it that because of the voices, the whispers. People hear things out there. Things they shouldn't." "What kind of things?" I pressed. My curiosity piqued despite the unease creeping up my spine. Daniel sighed, leaning back in his chair. "There's a story. Decades ago, back in the 1940s, an orphanage brought a group of kids up here for a camping trip. A storm hit, and the bus they were on went off the trail. It crashed into a ravine. They say none of the children made it out. The bodies were never found, just the wreckage. Some say their spirits still wander the woods, looking for help." "Ghost stories," I said, forcing a smile though my stomach churned. "Maybe," Daniel said, his tone dark. "But people have disappeared near that trail too. Hikers, campers. They follow the voices and never come back." I should have left then. I should have packed up my RV and driven far, far away. But something compelled me to stay. Curiosity, maybe, or stubbornness. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside. They were soft, shuffling, like someone pacing around the RV. Then came the tapping again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, heart pounding, and glanced at the window. A pale face stared back at me, a little girl, no older than 8, with stringy dark hair and hollow eyes. She was drenched, as if she'd just stepped out of a lake, water dripping down her face. I screamed, and she vanished. When I worked up the courage to go outside, I found a puddle of water beneath the window. The footprints were back, leading into the forest. The next morning, I followed them. The footprints led me off the trail and into a dense thicket of trees. It was slow going, the ground uneven and covered in brambles. Finally, I stumbled into a small clearing, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. There was a memorial of sorts, wooden crosses sticking out of the dirt, some rotted and broken. Around them were trinkets, rusted toys, a child's shoe, a decaying teddy bear, and at the center, a mound of earth that looked disturbingly like a collapsed burial site. As I knelt to examine it, the voices started. "Help us!" The whisper was so close, I whipped around, expecting to see someone behind me, but the clearing was empty. "Please, find the truth!" The whispers grew louder, overlapping, surrounding me. I stumbled back, my head spinning. Then I saw her again. The little girl, standing at the edge of the clearing. "Who are you?" I whispered. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She raised a hand, pointing toward the mound. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the RV, staring out into the darkness, waiting for the tapping to start. When it finally came, I wasn't surprised. This time, Evelyn, the name I'd given the girl in my mind, appeared inside the RV. One moment I was alone, and the next she was there, sitting on the floor, her hollow eyes fixed on me. "You have to help us," she said, her voice thin and echoing. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, my throat dry. "Bring them home," she said. The next morning, I returned to the clearing with a shovel. It took hours to dig through the rocky soil, but eventually, I hit something metallic. My stomach lurched as I uncovered the twisted remains of a vehicle. A rusted bus, its frame warped and mangled. Beneath it, I found bones. Small bones. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. The whispers came again, softer now, as if thanking me. That's when I saw her one last time. Evelyn stood at the edge of the clearing, smiling faintly. She raised a hand in farewell, and as she faded into the mist, the whispers stopped. The authorities took over after I reported what I'd found. They confirmed the story. A bus crash, a cover-up by the orphanage to hide years of neglect and abuse. The remains were properly buried, and a memorial was erected at the site. But I don't think the spirits are entirely at rest. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my RV, I hear faint laughter or feel a sudden chill. And in the rearview mirror, just for a moment, I see Evelyn watching me. My name is Daniel Danny Moore, and I was 28 when it happened. This was a few years ago during a camping trip to Devil's Garden in Northern California. I'll never forget that place, the jagged lava fields, the eerie silence, and what we encountered there. I still wake up sweating in the middle of the night, replaying the screams and that thing's voice in my head. It started as a weekend trip. My girlfriend Sophie wanted new material for her travel vlog, and Devil's Garden seemed perfect, remote, rugged, and untouched. Her enthusiasm was infectious, even if I had reservations about hiking in such an isolated area. Joining us were Zach, my childhood best friend, and his girlfriend Emma, who dabbled in paranormal investigations as a hobby. Emma had heard rumors of strange occurrences in Devil's Garden. Stories about vengeful spirits and ancient curses tied to the Modoc tribe. I brushed it off as nonsense, but Emma was convinced we'd find something extraordinary. I wish I'd taken her more seriously. We left early on a Friday morning, the sun casting long shadows over the narrow roads as we wound through the desolate terrain. By noon, we reached the edge of the lava beds, parked the car, and loaded up our gear. That was when I first realized how unprepared we were. Zach had insisted we didn't need much, just the basics. But one of our flashlights was already flickering, and our map was so old it didn't mark half the trails we planned to explore. I bit my tongue, though. Zach's confidence was irritating, but I didn't want to ruin the mood. The landscape was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Blackened lava fields stretched as far as the eye could see, jagged rocks forming twisted spires and shallow caves. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, as if the land itself was watching us. We hiked for hours, eventually setting up camp near the entrance to a massive cave that Emma insisted we explore the next day. That first night, we sat around the fire joking and laughing as Zach passed around a flask. Sophie filmed everything for her vlog, narrating the day's highlights while the rest of us chimed in with goofy commentary. But as the fire burned lower, a strange unease settled over me. The wind had picked up, carrying with it faint whispers that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. I chalked it up to exhaustion and tried to shake the feeling, but then Emma spoke up. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice low and trembling. We all fell silent, listening. At first, there was nothing but the crackle of the fire. Then, faintly, I heard it. A soft, almost melodic murmur, like someone whispering a song just out of earshot. Zach laughed it off, claiming it was just the wind, but Emma looked pale. "It's not the wind," she whispered. "It sounds like voices." "Relax," Zach said, waving her off. "It's probably just the acoustics bouncing around the rocks. These caves are like natural amplifiers." I wanted to believe him, but something about the sound felt wrong. It wasn't random or chaotic like wind. It had rhythm, a pattern, as if it was meant to be heard. Still, I said nothing. No point in adding to the tension. The next day we ventured into the cave. The air inside was cold and damp, the walls slick with condensation. Our single working flashlight barely cut through the darkness, casting long, dancing shadows on the jagged walls. Deeper in, we found carvings, ancient petroglyphs etched into the stone. They depicted humanoid figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes, standing over smaller, human-like shapes that looked disturbingly like prey. Emma was ecstatic, snapping pictures and muttering about Modoc legends of spirits that fed on human fear. Zach, ever the skeptic, laughed and took one of the smaller stones with carvings on it as a souvenir. I told him to put it back. It felt wrong to disturb anything in this place, but he just shrugged and stuffed it into his pack. That night, the whispers returned, louder and closer. It wasn't just the wind anymore. I could hear my own name, faint and distant, as if carried on the breeze. Sophie noticed it too, her face pale as she clutched my arm. "Danny," she whispered, "something's not right." Zach dismissed our concerns, joking that we'd scared ourselves with all the ghost stories, but even he couldn't deny the growing tension. The forest felt alive, the shadows deeper and darker than they should have been. And then Zach went missing. It happened during an argument. He and I had been butting heads all day, about the trip, the carvings, everything. That night, he stormed off into the darkness, claiming he needed space. At first, I thought he'd cool off and come back, but an hour passed, then 2. When he didn't return, we grabbed our flashlights and started searching. We found his knife first, lying in the dirt near the edge of the lava field. A few feet away there was blood, just a small trail leading into a narrow cave. My stomach churned as we followed it, the beam of our flashlight flickering ominously. Inside, the air was freezing, our breath visible as we ventured deeper. And then we saw it. At the far end of the cave stood a figure. It looked like Zach. Same build, same clothes, but something was off. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. When he turned to face us, I felt my blood run cold. His face was wrong. The features stretched and distorted as if they didn't quite fit. And then he spoke. "Danny," he said, his voice hollow and echoing. "Help me." Sophie screamed, and I pulled her back as the thing took a step toward us. Its movements were stiff, the sound of cracking bones accompanying every step. Emma clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "That's not Zach," she whispered. "We need to leave." We ran, stumbling through the darkness as the thing pursued us. Its voice echoed through the cave, mimicking Zach's pleas for help, but beneath it, I could hear something else. A low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. When we finally emerged into the open air, the whispers were everywhere, circling us like a predator stalking its prey. Emma was the one who figured it out. Between gasps for breath, she pointed at Zach's pack, still slung over my shoulder. "The stone," she said. "We need to put it back." It made sense. The carvings, the whispers, the creature, all of it had started after Zach disturbed the artifact. With no better plan, we retraced our steps to the original cave, the whispers growing louder and more frantic with every step. I half expected the thing wearing Zach's face to appear at any moment, but it never did. Instead, the forest seemed to close in around us, the shadows growing longer and darker. When we reached the cave, I didn't hesitate. I threw the stone onto the altar where we'd found it and stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the whispers faded, replaced by a heavy silence that felt almost suffocating. I turned to Sophie and Emma, relief washing over me. But then I saw it. Standing at the edge of the cave was Zach, or what was left of him. His skin hung loosely from his frame, his eyes empty sockets that seemed to bore into my soul. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching us as we backed away. We made it back to the car just as the sun began to rise, the first rays of light chasing away the lingering shadows. We drove in silence, too shaken to speak, until we were miles away from Devil's Garden. Sophie never uploaded the footage from her vlog. When she reviewed it, she found something chilling. A figure standing in the background of every shot, watching us from the shadows. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in Devil's Garden. Was it a skinwalker, an ancient spirit? All I know is that Zach never came back, and I'll never set foot in that cursed place again. My name is Claire Mitchell, and I was 34 when it happened. I've always been fascinated by places with dark histories, the kind that carry whispers of tragedy and secrets buried in time. That's why I went to the Elfin Forest Recreational Reserve in Escondido, California. I thought it would be just another research trip for a story, something I could write about, sell to a magazine, and move on from, but I was wrong. Whatever happened in that forest, it hasn't let me go. It was early autumn, and the weather was perfect for camping. I'd heard about Elfin Forest through an old local legend, the story of an orphanage that burned down in the late 1800s, taking with it the lives of countless children. Some say the forest is haunted by their spirits. Others claim it's cursed. For me, it was irresistible. I arrived in my RV late in the afternoon, parking near the main trailhead. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of eucalyptus and damp earth. The forest was deceptively peaceful, the kind of place you'd expect families to hike and picnic. But as I ventured deeper, that peace took on a strange edge, as if the forest was holding its breath. The shadows beneath the twisted oaks seemed darker than they should have been, the rustle of leaves just a bit too deliberate. I hiked for hours, taking notes and snapping pictures for my research. When I finally set up camp near a grove of ancient trees, the sun was already dipping below the hills, casting the landscape in gold and deep purple. My RV was parked about a half-mile back, but I decided to stay out here overnight to better soak in the atmosphere. As I built a small fire and settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, it began. I was writing by the fire, the soft crackle of flames the only sound, when I heard it. Faint laughter, high-pitched and distant. I froze, my pen hovering over the notebook. At first, I thought it was just the wind carrying voices from some distant campers. But then the laughter came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, bare feet crunching on dry leaves. "Hello," I called out, my voice steady despite the unease curling in my chest. "Is someone there?" The forest answered with silence. I waited, listening intently, but heard nothing more. Shaking my head, I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, I'd been reading about ghost stories all week. It was easy to get spooked. The next morning, I decided to explore more of the forest. I followed a faint trail that wound through dense oaks and sycamores, eventually stumbling upon the ruins of what must have been the orphanage. It wasn't much, just the charred outline of a foundation and a crumbling stone wall overgrown with ivy. Still, I couldn't deny the heavy feeling that settled over me as I stepped inside. The air here was colder, and the silence deeper, as if the forest itself was mourning. On one of the walls I found faint scratches, too deliberate to be random. Names, dozens of them, etched by small, clumsy hands. A chill ran down my spine. I snapped a picture and turned to leave when I noticed something half buried in the dirt. It was a rusted toy horse, its paint long faded. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands, and felt an odd pang of sadness. I couldn't explain it, but it felt wrong to leave it there, so I slipped it into my bag. That night, the forest came alive. I was sitting in my RV reviewing the day's pictures when I heard a knock at the door. It was soft, hesitant, like a child's hand. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen another soul all day. Grabbing a flashlight, I approached the door and called out, "Who's there?" No answer. I opened the door slowly, shining the light into the dark. Standing just beyond the beam was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8, with pale skin and dark hair that hung in tangled curls. She wore a faded dress, the kind you'd expect to see in an old photograph. "Are you lost?" I asked, stepping outside. "Where are your parents?" She didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head and pointed toward the trees. "Can you help me find my brothers and sisters?" she asked, her voice soft and lilting. My gut told me to say no, to shut the door and stay inside, but something about her was compelling. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my jacket and flashlight. "Okay," I said. "Where did you last see them?" She turned without a word and began walking into the forest. I followed, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The girl moved quickly, her bare feet making no sound on the forest floor. As we walked, I tried to ask her questions, her name, where she was from, but she didn't respond. The deeper we went, the stranger the forest became. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in around us, their branches clawing at the sky. Then I saw them. Dark shapes moving between the trees. At first, I thought they were just shadows, tricks of the light. But as they grew closer, I realized they were figures, tall, thin, and silent. They had no faces, only smooth, featureless surfaces where eyes and mouths should have been. My breath caught in my throat and I froze. "Who are they?" I whispered. The girl stopped and turned to me. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes, there was something ancient in them. Something far too knowing for a child. "They're the Watchers," she said simply. "They make sure no one leaves." A wave of panic washed over me. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run. But before I could move, one of the figures stepped into the beam of my flashlight. Its body was wrong, too long, too thin, its limbs bending at impossible angles. It stood there, silent and still, as if waiting. "We're not supposed to be here," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to go back." The girl shook her head. "You took something," she said. "You have to put it back." The toy horse. My hand went to my bag instinctively, my fingers brushing against the cold, rusted metal. The moment I touched it, the Watchers moved. They didn't walk so much as glide, their bodies twisting and jerking as they closed in. My heart pounded as I dropped the bag and fumbled for the toy. The girl watched silently, her face calm as the figures loomed over us. Finally, I found it and held it out. "Take it," I begged. "Just take it." The girl didn't move. Instead, she pointed to a hollow in the ground, a small dark space that seemed to pulse with its own unnatural energy. Understanding dawned on me. They didn't want me to hand it over. They wanted me to return it to where it came from. With trembling hands, I placed the toy in the hollow and stepped back. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air around us shifted, the cold giving way to an almost unbearable pressure. The Watchers stopped moving, their bodies dissolving into the shadows. The girl smiled faintly, a flicker of something, gratitude, crossing her face. "Thank you," she said. And then she was gone. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV. The next thing I knew, I was behind the wheel, speeding down the narrow road, the forest shrinking in my rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. To this day, I can't explain what happened in the elfin forest. I never published the story, never even told anyone about it. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear the laughter of children, faint and distant, calling me back. My name is Jack Mercer, and I was 41 when it happened. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in ghosts or curses. I spent most of my life as a firefighter, running into burning buildings while everyone else was running out. I've seen plenty of bad things, sure, but nothing that couldn't be explained. Nothing that couldn't be dealt with. Until on board Rego. It was supposed to be a solo trip. I'd been taking these RV camping trips for years, partly to clear my head, partly to test my survival skills. I liked the challenge of being alone in the wilderness. It reminded me of my training days. Focused, simple, and disciplined. I picked Anza Borrego Desert State Park because of its isolation. 100 miles of sand, rock, and blazing heat sounded perfect. I arrived late in the afternoon, the desert sun hanging low in the sky. The heat shimmered off the sand like a mirage as I parked my RV near a trailhead. The Borrego Badlands spread out before me, endless ridges and canyons, the kind of place you could lose yourself in if you weren't careful. I set up a basic campsite and planned to hike out to explore some of the abandoned mines I'd read about the next morning. The first night was uneventful, the kind of quiet I'd been hoping for. I sat by the fire sipping coffee and staring up at the stars. Out there, away from city lights, the sky looked infinite. I was just starting to feel like myself again when I saw it, a flicker of light on a distant ridge. At first, I thought it was a camper's fire, or maybe the headlights of an off-road vehicle. But the way it moved didn't make sense. It wasn't steady. It flickered erratically, darting along the ridge like it had a mind of its own. I watched it for a while, trying to make sense of it. Eventually, I shrugged it off. Probably just a reflection or some atmospheric trick. The desert could play games with your senses if you let it. I should have left it at that. The next day, I set out early. The air was cool, the rising sun painting the Badlands in shades of gold and crimson. I hiked for hours, following an old trail that wound through the canyons. The land felt alive in a way that was hard to describe, like it was watching me, waiting. Around midday, I came across an abandoned mine. The entrance was partially collapsed, but I could see a narrow opening where someone had recently slipped through. Curious, I decided to take a look inside. The air in the mine was cooler, a welcome break from the heat, but it carried a strange metallic smell that set my nerves on edge. The deeper I went, the darker it got. My flashlight flickered, its beam cutting through the gloom. That's when I noticed the carvings on the walls, ancient petroglyphs etched into the stone. They showed figures standing in circles of fire, their arms raised as shadowy shapes loomed above them. My gut told me to turn back, but my curiosity kept me moving forward. And then I heard it, a voice, my voice. It echoed through the mine, low and distorted, repeating words I'd muttered to myself earlier in the hike. Stay focused, watch your step. The sound came from deeper in the tunnel, pulling me forward like a fish on a hook. When I turned a corner, my flashlight caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. It was me, or something that looked like me. It stood at the far end of the tunnel, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its movements jerky and mechanical. When it opened its mouth, my own voice echoed back at me, warped and hollow. "Jack!" I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The figure didn't move, just stood there staring with empty eyes. I turned and ran, tripping over rocks and debris as the whispers started. They followed me out of the mine, a chorus of voices that weren't quite human. When I finally burst into the sunlight, I didn't stop running until I was back at my RV. I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me, as if that would keep whatever was out there away. My hands were shaking, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd seen. A hallucination, I told myself, a trick of the light. Too much heat, not enough water. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. That night, the light returned. I was sitting in the RV, reviewing my gear, when I saw it flickering through the window. It was closer this time, hovering at the edge of the camp like it was waiting for me. Against my better judgment, I stepped outside, the cool night air biting at my skin. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice echoing across the silent desert. No answer. The light flickered again, and I felt a pull, an instinctual need to follow it. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the ridge, my boots crunching against the sand. As I climbed, the light moved ahead of me, always just out of reach. The air grew colder the higher I went, the ground beneath my feet shifting like it was alive. At the top of the ridge, the light disappeared. In its place was another mine, this one larger, its entrance gaping like the mouth of a beast. I hesitated, every part of me screaming to turn back, but something inside pushed me forward. The air inside the mine was frigid, the walls slick with condensation. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. I followed the tunnel, the whispers growing louder with each step. And then I saw it. At the center of the chamber was a swirling vortex of flame and shadow. It flickered and pulsed, its edges shifting like smoke. The petroglyphs on the walls glowed faintly in its light, and I realized they weren't just decorations, they were a warning. This was the Devil's Fire, the entity the stories had spoken of. It fed on guilt, on fear. I felt its presence wrap around me, heavy and suffocating. Memories I'd buried deep began to surface, the fire that had taken my partner, the screams I couldn't drown out, the endless questions of what I could have done differently. The entity seemed to grow stronger, its flames burning brighter as my guilt consumed me. "Jack," it whispered, the voice filling the chamber. "You left him. You let him burn." I dropped to my knees, the weight of it crushing me. For a moment, I thought I'd let it take me, let it burn away the guilt that had haunted me for years. But then something inside me snapped. A voice, my voice, cut through the chaos. "No," I said, pushing myself to my feet. "Not this time." I grabbed the nearest rock and hurled it into the vortex. The flames roared, the shadows recoiling as the chamber began to collapse. I ran, the tunnel crumbling behind me as the whispers turned to screams. By the time I burst into the open air, the mine was gone, swallowed by the earth. I don't know how I made it back to my RV. The drive out of Anza Borrego was a blur, the desert stretching endlessly around me. When I finally reached civilization, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, I pulled over and sat in silence. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that mine. Maybe it was real, maybe it wasn't. But one thing is certain, whatever was out there, it wasn't done with me. Every so often I catch a flicker of light on the horizon, and I know the Devil's Fire is still watching, waiting for me to fall again. My name is Emily Cooper. I'm 30 years old, and this happened just last summer when my husband Brad and I took what should have been the most romantic trip of our lives, a belated honeymoon through California. We were road tripping in an old RV we'd rented, hopping from park to park, taking in the beauty of the state. It was supposed to be perfect, an adventure to remember forever. Well, we certainly remember it. but not for the reasons we hoped. It all started when we decided to visit Humboldt Redwoods State Park. I'd always dreamed of seeing the ancient giants of the Avenue of the Giants, towering trees that had stood for centuries, their roots entrenched in the secrets of time. I'm an amateur photographer, and I was dying to capture their majesty. Brad, ever the cautious planner, was hesitant about the isolation, but he indulged me. He wanted me to be happy, even if it meant camping in a remote spot far from the safety of crowded campgrounds. The first day passed like a dream. The forest was everything I'd imagined, and more. The air was cool and rich with the scent of pine, and the redwoods rose like silent guardians, their immense trunks stretching endlessly into the sky. I snapped photo after photo, marveling at the way the light filtered through the canopy, painting everything in shades of gold and green. But as night fell, the dream began to feel more like a distant memory. Brad had trouble getting the RV's generator to work properly. He muttered curses under his breath while tinkering with it, but even his engineering skills couldn't keep it from sputtering and groaning. "We'll have to manage without power tonight," he said, his voice tight with frustration. I shrugged it off, joking that it added to the rustic charm. He didn't laugh. The fog rolled in thick and fast that night, swallowing the forest whole. The dense silence that accompanied it was unnerving. I'd always thought of forests as alive with sound. Chirping crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. But here, there was nothing. Just a smothering stillness that pressed against the windows of the RV. I dismissed the unease as city-born paranoia. Nature's different out here, I told myself. But deep down, something felt wrong. The first strange thing happened the next morning. I was outside trying to capture the mist clinging to the trees when my camera malfunctioned. The lens froze mid-focus, and the display screen flickered before shutting off entirely. It had never done that before. I fiddled with it, but no matter what I tried, it wouldn't work. Frustrated, I gave up and joined Brad for breakfast, pushing the incident to the back of my mind. That afternoon, we ventured off the main trails to explore. It was my idea. I'd spotted what looked like an old, overgrown path leading deeper into the forest. Brad protested, saying we should stick to marked trails, but I convinced him it would be an adventure. "Think of the photos I'll get," I teased. He sighed, relenting, and we set off with a couple of water bottles and a basic map that was more decorative than functional. The deeper we went, the stranger the forest became. The trees seemed larger, older, their bark gnarled and twisted in unsettling patterns. A chill hung in the air, though the sun was still high. And then there were the tracks. At first, I thought they were bear prints, large, deep impressions in the soft earth. But they were wrong somehow. The toes were too long, and there were claw marks that didn't match anything I'd seen before. "Bear," Brad said when I pointed them out, though his voice lacked conviction. By the time we reached the clearing, I felt the first tendrils of fear creeping into my chest. The space was littered with bones, deer, rabbits, even smaller animals I couldn't identify. Most were stripped clean, though some still bore scraps of flesh. At the center of the clearing was a strange arrangement of stones, forming a crude circle. It looked deliberate, as if placed there by someone or something. Brad insisted we leave immediately. "This isn't normal," he said, grabbing my arm. "We need to get back to the RV." I didn't argue. As we retraced our steps, the fog returned, denser than before. It curled around us, muffling our voices and turning the trees into looming shadows. I swear I heard whispers in the mist, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to follow us. I told myself it was the wind, though I wasn't entirely convinced. When we finally reached the RV, it was late afternoon, but the fog made it feel like twilight. Brad's mood was grim, and I could tell he was on edge. I tried to lighten the atmosphere, but my jokes fell flat. We decided to stay inside for the evening, locking the doors and windows. That night, I woke to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder and more insistent. Brad stirred beside me, his brow furrowed in sleep. I froze, straining to listen. The sound was coming from outside near the back of the RV. When it stopped, I thought it was over. But then I heard a new noise, a low guttural growl that made my skin crawl. Brad woke up then, his eyes wide with alarm. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, too afraid to speak. The growl was followed by a scream, not a human scream, but something primal and otherworldly. It echoed through the forest, piercing the stillness like a blade. Brad grabbed the flashlight and peered out the window, but the fog was too thick to see anything. The next morning, we found claw marks on the RV's exterior, deep gouges that ran the length of the vehicle, as if something had tried to tear it open. The generator was completely destroyed, and several of our food supplies were missing. Brad tried to stay calm, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Desperate for answers, we drove to the nearest ranger station. The ranger, a grizzled man with a haunted look, listened in silence as we described our experience. When we finished, he leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "You've seen a wendigo," he said. "They're not supposed to be here, but sometimes they wander." I stared at him, incredulous. "A wendigo? Like the legend?" "It's no legend," he replied. "It's a spirit of hunger, drawn to isolation and desperation. It mimics voices, plays with its prey, and when it's ready, it feeds." Brad and I exchanged horrified glances. The ranger gave us a piece of advice. "Stay together, keep a fire burning, and whatever you do, don't follow any voices." We returned to the RV, our nerves frayed. Brad fashioned crude torches from sticks and rags, dousing them in lighter fluid. That night, we stayed awake, keeping the fire going and listening for any sign of the creature. It didn't wait long. The screams began just after midnight, circling the campsite like a predator stalking its prey. At one point, I heard Brad's voice outside calling my name. "Emily, come here. I need your help." I almost opened the door before realizing Brad was sitting beside me, his face pale and drawn. The wendigo revealed itself just before dawn. It emerged from the fog, a gaunt figure with hollow eyes and a skeletal frame. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on frayed strings. It stared at us, its gaze filled with a hunger that made my stomach churn. When it lunged at the RV, Brad threw one of the torches, setting the creature ablaze. It screamed, a sound so unearthly it felt like it would split my skull. The wendigo fled into the forest, its wails echoing in the distance. We didn't stay to see if it would return. As soon as the sun rose, we left the park, driving until we were miles away. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting. And sometimes in the dead of night I hear whispers in the fog. My name is Sarah Kent. I'm 42 years old, and I live for the quiet solace of nature. As a former wildlife photographer turned travel writer, I've spent much of my life chasing stories in wild, untouched places. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened last fall at Lake Hemet. I'd heard about Lake Hemet from a friend who swore it was a hidden gem. Nestled in the San Jacinto Mountains, it promised breathtaking views, tranquility, and inspiration for an article I was writing about California's overlooked camping spots. I packed my gear, loaded up my RV, and drove out, eager for a week of solitude and creativity. It was late October, the off-season. The The campground was nearly deserted when I arrived, just the way I liked it. I found a secluded spot on the far side of the lake, away from the main campsites. The water was still, reflecting the trees like a glassy mirror, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. It felt perfect, peaceful, or so I thought. The first day passed uneventfully. I wandered the shoreline, snapping photos of the lake and the golden autumn leaves. By the time I returned to the RV, the sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the water. The quiet was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. I tried to shake off the unease creeping into my chest. It was just the isolation, I told myself. Too many nights in the city had made me forget what real quiet felt like. The next morning, I stepped out to find wet footprints leading from the lake to my RV. They were small, like a child's. At first, I thought it was some early morning angler's kid exploring the campground, but when I scanned the area, there was no one in sight. I shrugged it off as a fluke, grabbed my camera, and headed out for another walk. As I explored, I came across the campground host, Dale. He was an older man with leathery skin and a tired expression. I waved and struck up a conversation, hoping to get some local insight for my article. "Quiet out here, isn't it?" I said. "Off-season always is," he replied, his tone guarded. "You're the only camper on this side of the lake." That gave me pause. "No one else is here?" He shook his head. "Not this time of year, too cold for most folks." I thought about the footprints and felt a twinge of unease. I decided not to mention them. Later that afternoon, I stopped in town to grab some supplies. At the local bar, I met a young bartender named Lila. She was friendly, chatty, and seemed to know everyone's business. When I mentioned where I was staying, her expression darkened. "Lake Hemet, huh?" she said. "You hear about the boy?" "What boy?" "The one who drowned. Happened decades ago. They say his ghost still wanders the lake looking for company." I laughed nervously. "Come on, that's just a campfire story." Lila shrugged. "Maybe, but people disappear out there sometimes, especially in the off-season. Just be careful." Her words stayed with me as I drove back to the lake. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I sat in the RV editing photos, I heard soft splashing outside. Peering through the window, I saw ripples spreading across the water, though there wasn't a breeze in the air. When I stepped outside to investigate, the night was silent. Still. And then I saw him. A boy, maybe 10 years old, standing knee-deep in the lake. His clothes were soaked, clinging to his thin frame. He stared at me, unblinking, his face pale and expressionless. My heart leapt into my throat. "Hey, are you okay?" I called, taking a step closer. The boy didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked deeper into the water until he disappeared beneath the surface. Panicking, I sprinted to the shoreline, shouting for him, but the water was still, black as ink. There was no sign of him. Shaken, I returned to the RV, locking the door behind me. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the boy's face staring back at me. The following morning, I found more wet footprints near the RV. This time, they circled the vehicle, as if someone had been pacing around it. Inside, the air felt damp, and a faint, briny smell lingered. My laptop, which I'd left on the table, had a strange message on the screen. "Help me." I tried to convince myself it was just a glitch, a coincidence. But deep down, I knew better. By now, the story Lila had told me weighed heavily on my mind. I decided to speak to Dale again, hoping for some answers. When I asked him about the boy, his face darkened. "You saw him, didn't you?" he said quietly. I nodded. Dale sighed, his gaze distant. "I've seen him too, a few years back. tried to ignore it, told myself it was a trick of the light, but then things started happening. Scratches on my trailer, wet handprints on the windows. One night, I heard him calling my name. "What does he want?" I asked. Dale shook his head. "I don't know, but I'll tell you this, don't go near the water." That evening, I tried to keep busy, hoping distraction would keep my mind off the boy. But as night fell, the atmosphere grew heavier. The wind howled through the trees, and the lake seemed to glow faintly under the moonlight. Then came the laughter. A child's laugh, soft and faint, drifting through the night. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was coming closer, circling the RV. "Go away," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who or what I was speaking to. The laughter stopped. Then, from outside, I heard my own voice. "Sarah, come here. I need your help." It was my voice, but twisted, warped. A cold chill ran down my spine. I pressed my back against the RV door, willing myself to stay inside. Dale's warning echoed in my mind. "Don't go near the water." The voice called again, pleading now. "Please, Sarah, help me." I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to open the door. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I couldn't tell. Eventually, the voice faded, leaving me in suffocating silence. The next morning, I resolved to uncover the truth. I spent the day researching the boy's story, poring over old newspapers in the local library. I learned his name was Peter, a 10-year-old who drowned in the lake in the 1970s. Witnesses said he had been playing near the water with friends when he fell in. None of them could save him. I found his grave in a small cemetery on the outskirts of town. The headstone was simple, weathered by time. I knelt before it, leaving a bouquet of wildflowers I'd picked along the way. "I'm sorry, Peter," I whispered. "You didn't deserve this." As I drove back to the RV, I felt a strange sense of calm. Maybe acknowledging Peter's tragedy was enough to give him peace. But the calm didn't last. That night, the boy appeared again, standing by the lake. This time, he looked different. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. He raised a hand, beckoning me. Against my better judgment, I stepped outside. My feet carried me to the shoreline, where the water lapped gently at the sand. Peter gestured again, and I waded into the lake, the cold water biting at my skin. "Sarah," he said, his voice soft and haunting. "Help me." Before I could respond, a cold, clammy hand grabbed my wrist and pulled me under. I thrashed and gasped, the icy water filling my lungs. Beneath the surface, I saw Peter, his expression one of sorrow and desperation. Around him floated other faces, pale and lifeless, their eyes empty. The grip on my wrist tightened, dragging me deeper. But as the darkness closed in, a memory of my brother flashed in my mind, his smile, his laugh. I fought back with everything I had, breaking free and clawing my way to the surface. Gasping for air, I stumbled onto the shore. Peter was gone, the lake eerily still once more. I left Lake Hemet the next morning, my hands trembling on the wheel. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Peter standing on the shore, watching me. He raised his hand, and for a moment I thought he was waving goodbye. Or was he asking me to come back? I don't know, and I hope I never find out. My name is Ethan Grayson. I'm 37 years old, and for the past 2 years I've been traveling solo in my RV, documenting America's most haunted and infamous places for my YouTube channel, Haunted Trails. What started as a hobby has become a full-time gig, and my subscribers eat up the eerie locales I explore. But nothing I've ever encountered compares to what happened at Devil's Gate Dam in Pasadena, California. I haven't uploaded a single video from that trip. I'm not sure I ever will. It all started with a tip from a viewer. He sent me a long email about the dam's dark history. Built in the 1920s, Devil's Gate earned its name from the rock formation near its base that supposedly resembled a horned demon. In the 1940s, a group of occultists performed rituals there, claiming it was a gateway to hell. The idea was absurd, of course, nothing more than urban legend, but the tales of people disappearing near the dam were hard to ignore. It sounded like perfect content for my channel, so I mapped out the location and planned to camp nearby for a few nights. When I arrived, the place had an unsettling vibe. The dam loomed like a concrete giant, its graffiti-covered tunnels gaping like open mouths. The surrounding area was overgrown, with trails winding into dense, thorny brush. I parked my RV in a clearing about half a mile from the dam, away from the main road. It was quiet, eerily so. No distant hum of traffic, no chirping birds, just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. The first day went smoothly enough. I filmed drone footage of the dam and took a walk along the trails, narrating the area's history for my camera. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows stretched long and sharp, turning the landscape into something alien. Back at the RV, I reviewed the day's footage. That's when I noticed the first glitch. The audio had static. Faint at first, but it grew louder in places, drowning out my voice. And then there was the whispering. It wasn't me, and it wasn't the wind. It was something else. I rewound and listened again. The whispers weren't clear, but they sounded like chanting, low and rhythmic. I brushed it off. Probably interference, I thought. I told myself I'd fix it in post-production and went to bed, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was off. The next morning, I set out to explore the dam's tunnels. They were exactly as creepy as I'd imagined. Graffiti covered the walls, mostly the usual stuff, but some of it was strange. Symbols, pentagrams, spirals, and other sigils I didn't recognize. Some were faded, but others looked fresh, the paint still glossy. Inside the tunnels, the air was damp and cold. My footsteps echoed, and water dripped somewhere deep within the concrete maze. As I ventured further, my flashlight beam caught something carved into the wall, a jagged, almost frantic symbol that gave me a chill. I snapped a picture and moved on, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. That's when I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing at the far end of the tunnel. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness, just for a moment, before it turned and disappeared. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, gripping my flashlight so hard my knuckles turned white. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. No response. I told myself it was just my imagination. Or maybe another explorer. People came to Devil's Gate all the time, drawn by its reputation. But when I reached the end of the tunnel, there was no one there. No footprints, no sign anyone had been there at all. That night, I met Martha Collins. She was an older woman, maybe in her 50s, who lived in a ramshackle cabin not far from the dam. I found her chopping wood when I wandered too far off the trail. She didn't look surprised to see me. "You shouldn't be here," she said, leaning on her axe. I explained I was a vlogger, here to document the dam's haunted history. She snorted. "Haunted? That's putting it lightly." "What do you mean?" I asked. Martha sighed, looking me over like she was debating whether to tell me the truth. Finally, she said, "Back in the day, they didn't just mess with spirits. They summoned something they couldn't control." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "You mean the rituals? The occult stuff?" She nodded. "Those fools opened a door, and something came through. It's still here, waiting for people like you. Curious people." I wanted to laugh it off, but her expression stopped me. She wasn't joking. "Have you seen it?" I asked. Martha hesitated. "I don't talk about it, and you shouldn't either. You should pack up and go." I didn't take her advice. I should have. That night, the real horror began. I was editing footage in the RV when the first strange noise broke through the silence. A sharp knock on the side of the vehicle. My heart skipped. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the clearing. Nothing. As I turned to go back inside, I saw it, hanging from a tree branch. A goat's skull, weathered and cracked, with burnt candle wax dripping from its horns. My stomach churned. I hadn't noticed it earlier. Someone must have put it there, but who? I locked the RV door and double-checked the windows, my nerves on edge. Hours passed, but I couldn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., the knocking returned. Louder this time, persistent. I held my breath, clutching a kitchen knife as I listened. Then came the whispers, the same ones I'd heard on my footage. They surrounded the RV, rising and falling in an eerie rhythm. Finally, I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the RV. My blood ran cold. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just an animal. But when I peeked through the curtains, I saw the shadow, tall, thin, with elongated limbs. It stood just outside the window, unmoving. Its red eyes glowed like embers in the darkness. And then it spoke. "You opened the door," it said, its voice guttural and unnatural. "You called me." I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The shadow vanished, leaving me trembling and alone. The next day, I found the book. I was hiking near the dam, hoping daylight would chase away the fear. I stumbled upon a hidden alcove, overgrown with vines. Inside was an old, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. It was filled with strange symbols and handwritten notes in Latin. My high school lessons failed me, but one word kept repeating: demonium, demon. The notes detailed rituals for summoning power from beyond, but they came with warnings. The price is the soul. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. Was this what Martha had meant? Had those occultists really unleashed something? I decided to burn the book. If it was the source of the evil, destroying it might stop whatever was happening. That night, I built a fire near the RV and tossed the book into the flames. The fire roared unnaturally high, turning from orange to black. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices screaming from the fire. The shadow appeared again, stepping into the firelight. Its grotesque face twisted into a grin. "You cannot undo what has been done," it hissed. "The door is open, and you are marked." I looked down and saw the sigil carved into my forearm, bleeding as if freshly cut. My mind raced. Was this from the tunnels? Had I unknowingly completed some ritual? I knew I couldn't stay. I grabbed my keys, threw everything into the RV, and started the engine. But as I drove away, the shadow followed, its red eyes visible in the rearview mirror. It didn't run. It didn't need to. It was inside me now, bound by whatever ritual had been completed. I left Devil's Gate Dam that night, but I'm not free. Even now, I feel its presence, watching, waiting. Sometimes, I wake at 3:13 a.m. to the sound of whispers outside my window. And the sigil on my arm? It never healed. The footage from that trip remains untouched on my hard drive. Maybe one day I'll upload it, but if I do, I have a feeling the whispers won't just follow me. They'll follow you too.